Cedarvale, Virginia, a picturesque, sleepy town tucked away from the hustle and bustle of city life. Known for its tree-lined streets, quaint houses, and the close-knit community that seemed too perfect to be true. Among the many families in this tight-knit town, one stood out as a beacon of success and happiness, the Harringtons. Ryan and Charlotte Harrington, along with their 5-year-old daughter, Ella, seemed like the epitome of the American dream. Ryan, a well-respected pediatrician at Cedarvale Regional Hospital, was known for his gentle bedside manner and unwavering dedication to his young patients. His career was thriving, and his colleagues admired him. Charlotte, on the other hand, was beloved by everyone in the town. As a guidance counselor at Little Acorns Preschool, she was the nurturing soul everyone turned to for advice. Together, they were seen as pillars of the community, the couple everyone admired, the parents others aspired to be. Their daughter, Ella, was the shining star of their family. At just 5 years old, Ella had already captured the hearts of everyone who met her. Bright-eyed, energetic, and always full of laughter, she was the picture of health and happiness. It seemed like every time Ryan and Charlotte posted about her on social media, the town showered them with praise. Their Instagram posts were filled with heartwarming family moments, Ella's first steps, their beach vacations, cozy movie nights at home. The Harringtons were the perfect family, their life so flawless it felt almost out of reach for most. On weekends, Ryan and Charlotte would often be seen strolling through Cedarvale's parks, Ella's stroller pushed proudly between them. Their friends and neighbors would stop to chat, commenting on how devoted the couple was, never missing an event or a chance to shower Ella with affection. "You guys are the model family," they would say, and Charlotte and Ryan would smile, nodding in agreement. Their lives were perfect, and the whole town was watching, admiring, envying, and quietly believing that they had everything figured out. But it wasn't always as perfect as it appeared. The cracks began to show subtly at first, small details that no one seemed to notice, except for those closest to the Harringtons. It started one day when Charlotte shared an unsettling update on social media. Ella, who had always been full of energy, had begun complaining of stomach aches. Then came the nausea, the dizziness, the fatigue. It was troubling, but Charlotte remained composed, offering updates with a calmness that made it seem like everything was under control. "Ella's doing better, just had a little bump in the road," she wrote in one post. But it was the type of post that made you question, was everything truly fine? Charlotte and Ryan were doing everything they could to find out what was wrong. They took Ella to doctor after doctor, but no one could pinpoint the cause of her mysterious symptoms. It seemed to everyone that the doctors were baffled. How could a healthy, energetic child suddenly become so sick? It didn't make sense, and yet, it was happening. As the weeks passed, Ella's condition seemed to worsen. The once lively girl was now often found sitting in corners, eyes dull, no longer eager to play or interact. Her spark was fading. Ryan and Charlotte continued to share updates online, but the photos began to feel forced, as though they were trying to convince the world that everything was okay, when, in reality, the world seemed to be slipping through their fingers. Neighbors rallied around the Harringtons, offering meals, prayers, and support. They couldn't imagine what the family was going through. "It must be so hard," they would say. "They're such great parents. If anyone deserves support, it's them." The Harringtons seemed so perfect, so committed to their daughter, that no one questioned the mounting tension in their home. In the midst of all this, something strange began to happen. Ella's condition fluctuated in the most unusual ways. One day she seemed to improve, the next, she was worse than ever. But what was most troubling was how her symptoms would often seem to worsen at certain times, usually when Ryan was around, or more specifically, when he was home from the hospital. It was a subtle observation, one that might have been dismissed by many. But for those who were paying attention, it felt off. There were whispers. Not loud, not accusing, but whispers nonetheless. "Have you noticed Ella's condition seems to worsen when Ryan's here?" one neighbor quietly remarked. "I swear I saw her running around the backyard last week, but then Charlotte said she could barely get out of bed later that night." People dismissed these thoughts as coincidences, but deep down, something didn't sit right. The Harringtons continued to live out their charade, crafting the perfect image for the world to see. Charlotte volunteered at PTA events, organizing fundraisers and bake sales. Ryan coached Ella's youth soccer team when he wasn't at the hospital. Their home became the hub for neighborhood gatherings, and their backyard barbecues were legendary. People from all over Cedarvale clamored for an invitation to their warm, welcoming home. But there were small moments, little things that didn't quite add up. For example, the day that Ryan and Charlotte threw a lavish birthday party for Ella. She had just been complaining of stomach pains the day before, but no one questioned it. The party was a grand success. The photos were flawless. The guests, delighted. But something inside Charlotte's eyes told a different story, a quiet desperation that no one seemed to notice. The pressure to keep up the appearance of the perfect family was slowly eating away at Charlotte. And as Ella's health continued to decline, so did the facade. Ryan, ever the devoted husband and father, threw himself into work at the hospital, using his career to escape the mounting chaos at home. He didn't know how to help his daughter, and he didn't know how to stop Charlotte. As they posted photos of their smiling family on social media, their world behind the camera was becoming darker. Something was wrong, but they were hiding it, even from themselves. With each passing day, the truth about the Harringtons' perfect family was starting to unravel. The community continued to rally around them, but they had no idea what was really happening behind closed doors. What was truly going on in that house on Maplewood Lane? The answers were more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The sunny days of summer in Cedarvale, Virginia, should have been a time for family picnics, community events, and the joys of a well-kept life. But beneath the facade of the Harrington family's perfect existence, a storm was beginning to brew. Ella's mysterious illness, which had started with a few complaints of stomach aches, was rapidly spiraling out of control. By the time June rolled around, Ella's once radiant spirit had dimmed. She was no longer the vibrant little girl who would race around the neighborhood on her bicycle or laugh in the park with her friends. Instead, she was pale, lethargic, and increasingly withdrawn. Charlotte, ever the perfectionist, couldn't bear the thought of anyone seeing her daughter in such a state. Every day, she posted another update on social media, each post more desperate than the last. "Ella's fighting hard," she would write. "Thank you all for your prayers. We're getting through this, one day at a time." But as the days wore on, the posts became less about Ella's recovery and more about Charlotte's own distress. The more Charlotte shared about Ella's condition, the more questions began to surface. There were inconsistencies in her stories that no one could ignore. One evening, a neighbor, Linda, had visited to drop off a casserole. When she saw Ella playing outside, laughing and running around with a group of kids, she thought nothing of it. But just hours later, Charlotte posted an update online saying, "Ella is too weak to get out of bed tonight." Linda, confused, returned home and replayed the scene in her head. It didn't make sense. Ryan, too, was starting to notice the strange shifts in Ella's symptoms. There were days when she seemed almost back to her old self, playing in the backyard with their dog, following him around the kitchen as he prepared dinner. Yet, the next day, she would be lying on the couch, barely able to sit up, complaining of exhaustion. It wasn't the disease the doctors had diagnosed. No one could pinpoint the cause, and no one could explain the erratic patterns. Ryan tried to focus on his work at Cedarvale Regional Hospital, but his mind was constantly pulled back to the house. Every time he spoke to Charlotte, her eyes betrayed a deep worry, almost an obsession. He had always known her to be a little overprotective, but this was different. She had begun to carry Ella's medical records with her everywhere, obsessively checking and rechecking notes from the doctors. She spent hours on the phone with specialists, only to hang up and dive into the depths of medical journals. But the most unsettling moment came one night after dinner, when Ryan caught Charlotte in the middle of something he couldn't quite understand. He had come home late from the hospital, tired from his long shift. As he stepped into the kitchen, he noticed Charlotte standing by the counter, her hands trembling as she crushed something in a small ceramic bowl. He couldn't see what it was, but the look in her eyes, dark and filled with a kind of frantic energy, made his stomach churn. "What's going on, Charlotte?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She turned to him, her face pale but her expression fierce. "I'm doing what I have to do," she snapped. There was something almost wild in her tone, something that sent a chill up Ryan's spine. He tried to push her to explain, but she waved him off, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "I'm trying to help her," she muttered, almost to herself, as she quickly hid whatever she had been grinding. That night, Ryan couldn't sleep. The images of Charlotte in the kitchen haunted him. Something wasn't right. He didn't know what was happening, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his wife was hiding something far darker than he could ever imagine. The following day, Ryan stayed home from work. He watched Charlotte as she obsessively documented every detail of Ella's condition, scribbling notes in a thick binder she carried with her everywhere. It wasn't normal. This wasn't the typical motherly care he had seen before. There was something methodical about her actions, as though she was preparing for something. He decided to call the pediatrician, Dr. Sofia Martinez, and request another round of tests for Ella, convinced that there was something being overlooked. As he hung up the phone, Charlotte walked into the room, her eyes wide with panic. "You don't need to do that, Ryan," she said, her voice quivering. "She's fine. She's going to be fine." Ryan stared at her, feeling a knot form in his chest. He had never seen her like this before. The woman he had married, the woman he had trusted with their daughter's well-being, was slowly unraveling in front of him. But he couldn't ignore the facts. The situation was becoming worse, not better. That night, as Ryan lay awake in bed, he listened to the sound of Charlotte pacing in the living room, her footsteps echoing in the stillness of the house. He couldn't help but wonder, was he missing something? Could his wife, the woman he thought he knew, be involved in something far more sinister than he ever imagined? The cracks in the perfect facade of the Harrington family were no longer subtle. The truth, as terrifying as it was beginning to surface, and Ryan was on the brink of uncovering the darkness that lay behind Charlotte's obsession with keeping up appearances. It was an ordinary Wednesday afternoon when Ryan's world began to unravel. He had stayed up late the night before, going through Ella's medical records, something he had never done before. His job as a pediatrician gave him access to an extensive knowledge of illnesses, but what he was seeing in his own daughter's file didn't add up. Symptoms that didn't match any known illness, tests that seemed inconclusive, and patterns that repeated themselves in bizarre, almost unnerving ways. But there was one detail that stood out, the timing of Ella's worsening health. Ella's condition seemed to follow a peculiar cycle, one that was almost too precise to be a coincidence. On days when Ryan was home from the hospital, Ella appeared to show slight improvement. She would eat a little, play with her toys, even laugh. But when Ryan was working late, her symptoms would spike. She would suddenly grow pale, feverish, and weak, unable to lift herself from the couch. The doctors had said it could be a viral infection, but Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more sinister at play. The tipping point came when Ryan had an offhand conversation with one of his colleagues, Dr. Jason Ford, a pediatric specialist at Cedarvale Regional. They had been talking about a particularly tricky case when Jason casually mentioned that he had overheard one of the nurses gossiping about an odd pattern with Ella's illness. "It's strange," Jason had said, lowering his voice. "Whenever Ryan's at the hospital for his long shifts, Ella's symptoms seem to worsen. But when he's home, she's almost better." The words hit Ryan like a brick. He froze, unable to respond immediately. Could it be true? It was then that the seed of doubt truly took root. That night, after dinner, Ryan confronted Charlotte. He had avoided asking her the tough questions until now, too afraid to face the possibility that something was wrong within their family. But tonight, something snapped inside him. "Charlotte, what's going on?" His voice was tight, full of frustration and fear. "I've been looking at Ella's records, and the doctors, nothing adds up. And I've been talking to people, and there's something I need to know." Charlotte's face went pale. Her eyes darted nervously, but she quickly masked it with a smile. "What are you talking about, Ryan?" she replied, her voice strained but calm. "Ella's just sick. We're doing everything we can." "No, Charlotte," Ryan snapped, unable to control the anger rising in his chest. "Something isn't right. You've been acting strange, and the timing of her symptoms, it's too much of a coincidence. I need to know the truth." Charlotte took a step back, as though recoiling from his words. "I don't know what you're implying," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Ella's sick, Ryan. You're not here to see what it's like. You don't understand." But Ryan could see the fear in her eyes. It wasn't just fear for Ella's health, it was fear of him discovering something she wasn't ready to confront. "Tell me what's going on, Charlotte," Ryan demanded, his voice rising. "Are you hiding something from me?" There was a long silence before Charlotte finally spoke. Her words, when they came, were barely above a whisper. "I'm just trying to help her, Ryan. We're doing this for her. For all of us." Ryan's mind raced. "What do you mean?" "Doing what?" Charlotte paused, and for a brief moment, Ryan thought he saw a flash of something dark, something beyond the worried mother he had known all these years. I'm trying to get her better. I'm doing whatever it takes. I'm saving her," she said, her voice tinged with a frantic edge. Ryan was taken aback. "You're saving her?" "Charlotte, what are you talking about?" But before she could respond, there was a knock at the door. Ryan's heart skipped a beat. It was too late for visitors. Who could it be? Ryan opened the door to find a neighbor standing there, looking visibly concerned. Linda, the woman who had been at their house earlier in the week, handed him a piece of paper. "I don't know if this means anything, but I think you should see it," she said, her voice shaky. The paper was a scribbled note from Ella's preschool teacher, Ms. Maggie Rivers, written in haste. "I'm worried about Ella. I've noticed her acting different lately. Yesterday, she drew a picture of a girl, with sad eyes, surrounded by medicine bottles. At the top of the picture, she wrote, 'Mommy's special medicine makes me sick.'" Ryan's blood ran cold. The room spun as he held the note in his trembling hands. This couldn't be happening. This was no longer just a health issue. It was something much darker. "Charlotte," Ryan's voice was hoarse, barely audible, but filled with horror. "What's going on? What's really happening to Ella?" Charlotte's eyes darted around the room, her face twisted with panic. "Ryan, please," she whispered. "You don't understand. I had to do this. I'm doing this for us. For her." Ryan's heart pounded in his chest. He knew. He knew what she meant now. The weight of the truth hit him like a freight train. Charlotte had been poisoning their daughter. She wasn't trying to help her, she was using Ella as a pawn in some twisted game of control and sympathy. "I never wanted to do this," Charlotte said, her voice breaking as she stepped back from him. "But we needed the money. We needed the support. Everyone was so kind, and I thought maybe if I made Ella sick, they would help us. They would see us as the perfect family and give us everything we needed." Ryan felt as if the ground had fallen out from under him. The woman he had loved, the mother of his child, had crossed an unimaginable line. He couldn't even look at her anymore. His mind reeled. How could she? How could she do this to their daughter? The realization shattered Ryan's perception of everything he had ever known. The perfect family he thought he was part of, the life they had built, was a lie. The betrayal stung deeper than any physical wound. His daughter had been suffering, and he had been blind to it. He had trusted Charlotte, trusted her with everything, and she had used that trust to hurt their little girl. Ryan couldn't escape the image of that note. "Mommy's special medicine makes me sick." It echoed in his mind like a warning bell he had ignored for too long. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Ella's innocent face, smiling one minute, but the next, it was contorted with confusion and pain. How had he not seen it? How had he missed the signs that his own wife was capable of such horrors? The truth was unbearable, and yet, there it was, plain and undeniable. The next few days were a blur. Ryan felt like he was living in a nightmare, one he couldn't wake from. He had always trusted Charlotte. He had believed in their marriage, in the family they had built together. But now, everything felt like a lie. The beautiful home they had purchased on Maplewood Lane, the perfect image they had crafted for the world, it all seemed hollow. The cracks in their life, once small and unnoticed, had now torn open, revealing the chaos and darkness lurking beneath. Ryan confronted Charlotte again, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and desperation. "You're poisoning our daughter, Charlotte. You've been poisoning her. I know what you've done." His words cut through the silence of their home like a knife. Charlotte's face twisted with panic. For a moment, she looked like the woman he had married, the woman who had promised to be his partner, his equal. But in the next instant, that mask slipped. Her eyes darted around the room, avoiding his gaze. She trembled, her hands shaking as she tried to hold herself together. "I didn't mean to hurt her," she whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. "I just wanted to protect us. To protect her. I thought if I made her sick, we would get the help we needed. The attention, the sympathy, it was supposed to help us survive." Ryan recoiled. The woman he had once known had vanished. In her place was someone unrecognizable, someone he was terrified of. "You were supposed to be protecting her, Charlotte. You were supposed to love her. And this is how you repay her? How could you?" The words burned his throat, each one a stab to the heart. Charlotte's eyes filled with tears, but it was too late. The damage had been done. Ella had been suffering for weeks, maybe longer, all because her mother had twisted her love into something unrecognizable. Ryan felt like he was suffocating in a sea of guilt, regret, and rage. He had been blind. He had failed his daughter. Charlotte, now in tears, pleaded with him. "I didn't know what else to do, Ryan. I thought if I made her sick, people would care. I thought I could fix things. But I never meant for it to go this far. I never wanted her to really get hurt." Her voice broke, desperation creeping in. "I thought I was saving her." Ryan could hardly contain his fury. He took a step back, his mind racing. He couldn't process it. Couldn't wrap his head around what she was saying. The idea that his own wife had caused their daughter's pain was too much. And now, the truth of it was crashing down on him, making him question everything he had believed about her, and about their life together. It wasn't just about the pills or the poison. It was about control, about Charlotte's desperate need to feel important, to feel validated. And in her need for validation, she had destroyed their family. As Ryan turned away from her, his fists clenched, Charlotte's voice echoed in his head, "I thought I was saving her." It was a twisted lie, one he couldn't even begin to understand. And yet, she truly believed it. The next day, Ryan contacted a Child Protective Services agent, Detective Daniel Cross, who had been investigating the case for weeks. Cross had been following the signs of abuse and had started to connect the dots between Ella's fluctuating health and Charlotte's increasingly erratic behavior. When Ryan told him everything, about Charlotte's actions, the note from Ella's preschool teacher, and the inconsistencies in her illness, Detective Cross finally took the next step. The investigation was now official, and with it came the slow, painful unraveling of the Harringtons' carefully crafted world. But as Ryan sat in the sterile office of the detective's office, staring at the files and the evidence laid out before him, a sinking feeling hit him like a ton of bricks. They had never been a perfect family. Not even close. With Detective Cross's involvement, the weight of the investigation became all-consuming. Ryan knew the truth couldn't stay hidden any longer. The facade of their perfect life was falling apart, and with it, any hope of salvaging their family. But the hardest part was still to come, the realization that his daughter, his beautiful, innocent daughter, had been used as a pawn in a twisted game. The guilt was overwhelming. Ryan's heart raced as he sat in the sterile, brightly lit office of Detective Daniel Cross. The walls, lined with photographs and case files, felt like they were closing in on him. He had crossed a line, and now, there was no turning back. The truth was no longer a whisper in the dark, it was a harsh, blaring alarm that could no longer be ignored. Detective Cross, a seasoned investigator with years of experience in handling sensitive cases, had been following the strange patterns of Ella's health for weeks. As Ryan sat in front of him, he felt the weight of every second. There was no more pretending. The family he had once trusted had been a lie, a beautiful, painful lie that had almost destroyed his daughter. The first time I heard about this, I didn't want to believe it, Cross said, leaning forward in his chair, his gaze steady and intense. But the more I looked into Ella's condition, the more it became clear. There's something off about this entire situation. Ryan could feel his stomach churn. The detective had already seen the inconsistencies, the patterns, the troubling behavior of his wife. He couldn't avoid it any longer. Everything was coming to a head. I thought I was just blind to it, Ryan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I trusted her. I thought we were a team. But she did this. I don't know how to live with it. Cross nodded grimly. The system failed, Ryan. You weren't the only one who was blindsided. Your wife manipulated everyone. But we're going to make sure she doesn't get away with this. Ryan swallowed hard. He could barely look the detective in the eye. He felt as if his world had shattered, piece by piece. I don't know what to do. She's my wife, and my daughter. I love them both. How could she do this to our baby? His voice cracked with emotion, and for a moment, he felt like a stranger to himself. Cross leaned back, his face hardened. Sometimes, the people closest to us are the ones who hurt us the most. You're not the first to go through something like this, and you won't be the last. The words hit Ryan like a slap in the face. He had spent his life protecting his family, building the image of a perfect life for them both. He had been the provider, the protector, the pillar. And yet, he hadn't seen the cracks in his own home, the deadly secret festering behind closed doors. How had he missed it? How had he not seen the signs that the woman he had promised to love and protect had been poisoning their daughter, literally and figuratively? Detective, what do we do now? Ryan's voice trembled, the weight of everything crushing him. How do we fix this? How do I even begin to make this right? Cross's gaze softened, just for a moment. We don't fix it, Ryan. We bring the truth to light. We give Ella a chance to heal, and we make sure your wife is held accountable for what she's done. The investigation into Charlotte's actions moved swiftly after that meeting. Detective Cross called in Child Protective Services, CPS, and the first step was to take Ella into emergency care, far away from her mother's clutches. But even as the authorities moved in, Ryan couldn't shake the gut-wrenching feeling that he was too late to save his daughter from the trauma she had endured. The more Ryan spoke with Detective Cross, the more chilling details emerged. Charlotte had gone to great lengths to cover her tracks, using her charm and influence to keep people from questioning her. Her meticulous social media posts, detailing Ella's supposed illness and miraculous recovery, had created a facade so perfect, no one could see the darkness hiding behind it. The investigation began to unravel Charlotte's web of lies. CPS obtained records of the numerous visits to different specialists, all of whom had been duped by her. Doctors had prescribed medications for Ella's symptoms, but what no one knew was that Charlotte had been administering additional, unauthorized drugs. Drugs that, over time, were taking a toll on Ella's health. In interviews with people from the community, Ryan was forced to confront the full extent of Charlotte's manipulation. Several neighbors came forward, describing how Charlotte had solicited money, food, and support under the guise of her daughter's illness. They had believed every word. The whole town had rallied around the Harringtons, none the wiser to the fact that they were supporting a woman who was using their kindness to continue her dangerous game. As the investigation deepened, Ryan sat in the cold, impersonal waiting room of the police department, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. The day he had been dreading was finally here, the day the truth would come out. Ella was in a safe place now, but the damage had been done. His family, his entire life, was in pieces. How would he ever look at Charlotte the same way again? And how would he explain this all to Ella, who had suffered so much at the hands of the person who was supposed to love her most? The emotional burden was too much to bear. As the walls closed in on Charlotte, Ryan felt his chest tighten with anger, frustration, and regret. He had never imagined it would come to this. His perfect family, his perfect life, was now a shattered dream. And the worst part was the painful truth: he had been complicit in it all, blind to his wife's manipulation, unable to see the suffering of his daughter. The courtroom was cold. The air felt thick with tension as Ryan sat in the back row, barely able to keep his eyes open. The day had come, the moment when the truth about Charlotte's betrayal would finally be exposed. His stomach churned with dread, but he couldn't look away. He had already lost so much. Now, he was about to lose the last shred of his family. The evidence against Charlotte was overwhelming. Detective Cross had done his job, and the case had been built meticulously. Yet, sitting there, listening to the lawyers present the case, Ryan felt like he was sinking deeper into a nightmare. He had never imagined his life would come to this: the woman he had loved, the mother of his child, standing in front of him, facing the consequences of her actions. It didn't feel real. How could this be happening? The prosecutor stood and began laying out the case. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are here today because of a mother's unthinkable actions. Charlotte Harrington, by all appearances, was a loving mother, a devoted wife, and a beloved member of the community. But behind closed doors, she was poisoning her own daughter, Ella Harrington, for months, perhaps longer. Ryan's hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms as the prosecutor recounted the details of Ella's suffering. It was as if time had stopped. The words echoed in Ryan's mind: poisoning her own daughter. He couldn't breathe. He had seen the signs, he had even suspected something was wrong, but he hadn't been able to put it all together. Now, hearing it aloud, he could hardly comprehend what had happened. His own wife had caused their child's pain, manipulated everyone around them, and for what? For attention, for money, for sympathy. He could feel the rage building inside him, but there was nowhere to direct it. The damage was done. Charlotte stood at the front of the courtroom, her hands trembling, her face pale. She had become a shell of the woman Ryan had once known. There was no more pretense of the loving mother, no more false smiles or perfect family photos. The truth had shattered her. The mask was gone, and the darkness behind it was now laid bare. As the prosecutor continued, Ryan couldn't stop staring at Charlotte. He watched as she shifted nervously in her seat, occasionally glancing at him with a look of regret, or was it guilt? It didn't matter. Nothing could justify what she had done. Charlotte Harrington administered a cocktail of medications to her daughter, drugs that were not prescribed by any doctor. These medications caused Ella's health to decline rapidly. Charlotte manipulated her daughter's symptoms, making her sicker, all to maintain the illusion of a tragedy that would draw sympathy from their community. And all the while, she continued to use her daughter's suffering to manipulate those around her. Ryan's heart felt like it was being crushed in his chest. He had trusted her, he had stood by her through thick and thin. But Charlotte had used him. She had used their daughter as a tool in her twisted game. And now, he had to sit there, listening to everything he had once believed to be true being torn apart. The prosecutor continued, detailing how Charlotte had used social media to further her deceit, posting updates about Ella's illness and soliciting money from friends, neighbors, and even strangers. It was calculated, methodical. And what hurt most was that Ryan had never seen it. He had been blind, too trusting. He hadn't wanted to see the cracks in their perfect family. Then, the most damning evidence came forward, the note. Ella's drawing, which had been discovered weeks earlier, was presented to the jury. The drawing was simple, childish even, but the words written on it were haunting. "Mommy's special medicine makes me sick." Ryan felt like the room was spinning. He wanted to shout, to scream, to do something, but all he could do was sit there, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't just about his marriage falling apart. This was about his daughter. Ella had been in pain, and for so long, he hadn't known why. She had tried to tell them. She had tried to warn him. And he hadn't listened. The defense tried to argue, of course. They painted Charlotte as a woman under extreme stress, a mother overwhelmed by the demands of caring for a sick child. They tried to make excuses for her actions, to portray her as a victim of circumstances. But no amount of argument could hide the truth. No excuse could undo the harm she had caused. Ryan sat there, numb, as the jury deliberated. He thought about Ella, about how she had suffered, about how she had been manipulated by the one person who was supposed to protect her. He thought about the future, the one he had envisioned for them as a family, a future that now seemed impossible. How could he ever look at Charlotte the same way again? And how could he ever make this right for Ella? The room fell silent as the jury returned. Ryan's heart was in his throat as the foreman stood, his eyes scanning the room. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Charlotte Harrington, guilty of child abuse, fraud, and endangerment." The words hit Ryan like a punch to the gut. Guilty. It was over. But it wasn't enough. Nothing could undo what had been done. Nothing could bring back the innocence that had been taken from his daughter. The courtroom was filled with gasps and murmurs as the verdict was read. Ryan barely registered the reactions of the people around him. He was too lost in the aftermath of the truth being laid bare. Charlotte had done this, she had hurt their daughter, betrayed him, and destroyed everything they had worked for. The courtroom was deathly silent as the judge's gavel fell, sealing Charlotte's fate. "You are hereby sentenced to 30 years in prison without the possibility of parole," the judge intoned. The words echoed in Ryan's ears, but they didn't register. His mind was elsewhere, on Ella. His daughter, the one who had been forced to endure so much, was finally out of harm's way. But even as Charlotte's sentence was read, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that had settled deep in his chest. Charlotte stood there, frozen, as if the weight of the world had descended upon her. She didn't meet Ryan's eyes. He wasn't sure if she even saw him anymore. Her face was pale, drained of emotion, but her hands trembled ever so slightly. The tears that had once flowed freely when she was pleading for forgiveness were gone now, replaced by an eerie, almost vacant stillness. She had nothing left. The woman who had once been the center of his world, the mother of his child, was now a broken shell of a person, trapped in her own web of lies. Ryan sat back in his seat, his hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. He wanted to feel anger, to feel the catharsis of rage, but all he felt was numb. The emotions that had gripped him in the past few days, shock, disbelief, betrayal, had all but worn themselves out. What remained was a hollow shell of a man, mourning not just the loss of the family he thought he had, but the childhood innocence that had been stolen from Ella. The truth had finally come to light, but it hadn't come with a sense of relief. There was no joy in seeing justice served. No sense of satisfaction in knowing Charlotte would be held accountable. For Ryan, the damage had been done long before the trial. His trust had been shattered, his daughter's innocence stolen, and the life they had built together was now a memory he could never get back. Ryan left the courthouse with his head hung low, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the truth. The sky was overcast, as if even the heavens themselves mourned the events that had unfolded. He drove home in silence, the engine of the car humming beneath him as the world outside blurred by in a haze. His thoughts were consumed by one thing, Ella. He had to see her, hold her, make sure she knew she was safe now. But even as he thought about his daughter, he couldn't help but feel the pang of guilt, the crushing feeling that he had failed her. He should have known. He should have seen it. He should have stopped Charlotte before it ever got this far. When he finally reached home, Ryan stepped out of the car and walked into the house, but the emptiness hit him almost immediately. The house, once filled with laughter and love, now felt like a tomb. He slowly made his way to Ella's room, the one place in this house that still held a sliver of warmth. He opened the door and found her sitting on the bed, drawing in her sketchbook. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and filled with the kind of innocence that should never have been taken from her. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice soft, but it held a world of emotions. "Is Mommy coming home?" Ryan's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. How could he answer her? How could he explain to his precious daughter that her mother, the woman who should have protected her, had been the one who caused her pain? That the very person who was supposed to love her more than anyone had betrayed her in the most horrific way possible? "No, Ella," Ryan said, his voice thick with emotion. "Mommy. Mommy isn't coming home." His throat tightened as the words left his mouth. "But you're safe now. I promise you. I'll never let anyone hurt you again." Ella's small body tensed, her eyes searching his face as if trying to understand, trying to make sense of the world that had turned upside down. Ryan sat down beside her and pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. And for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to cry. He cried for the pain Charlotte had caused, for the betrayal that had shattered his family. But most of all, he cried for Ella, for the innocent little girl who had been caught in the crossfire of a twisted game, and for the future she now had to rebuild from the wreckage of her childhood. Ella clung to him, her small hands gripping his shirt as if she could pull him closer, as if she could erase the hurt with her love. Ryan kissed the top of her head, whispering over and over again, "You're safe. You're loved. You're going to be okay." As the days passed, Ryan took Ella to a new home, a safe place, away from the memories of betrayal. They found a small house in a quiet neighborhood, a fresh start, just the two of them. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be. The scars of the past would remain forever, but Ella was healing, slowly but surely. And so was he. Ryan spent every moment he could with her, making sure she knew she was not just his daughter, but the most important person in his life. They had lost so much, but they were finding each other again, piece by piece. The story of Ryan and Ella's ordeal is one that many could never fathom. The betrayal, the pain, the loss, it's a reality far too many face in silence. But there is hope, there is healing, and there is strength in the face of unimaginable hardship. What do you think about this story? How would you have reacted in Ryan's shoes? How do we, as a society, ensure that our children are always protected from the ones they trust the most? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Share your experiences, your feelings, and your reflections. Together, we can start a conversation, raise awareness, and make a difference. And most importantly, remember, no one should ever have to endure the pain of betrayal, especially at the hands of those who should protect them. Stay vigilant, stay compassionate, and always protect the most vulnerable among us. Please like, comment, and share this video to spread the message. The truth matters. Justice matters.